The cavernous halls of John F. Kennedy International Airport were alive with the familiar symphony of travel-rolling suitcases rattling across tiled floors, announcements echoing through the loudspeakers, and the hum of countless conversations blending into a restless chorus. Business people in tailored suits hurried past families juggling children and luggage, while tired tourists clutched their passports with nervous anticipation. For many, the airport was a place of chaos, but for Amara Johnson, it was a place of calm observation. Amara wasn't rushing. She didn't need to. She moved with an ease that came from years of traveling around the world, yet her appearance betrayed none of her status. Dressed in a pair of fitted dark jeans, a cream blouse, and a navy blazer, she looked like any other young professional heading to an important meeting. Her braided hair fell neatly to her shoulders, and the only accessory she wore was a simple silver bracelet that glinted softly under the fluorescent lights. In her hand, she carried a slim leather satchel, worn in the corners, the kind of bag that had seen countless boarding gates and still carried the faint scent of books and airports. No luxury brands, no designer luggage, nothing that screamed wealth or privilege. She liked it that way. Few knew that behind her modest presence was a staggering truth. Amara was one of the silent billionaires of her generation. As the heir to a sprawling investment empire and a principal backer of one of the largest airlines in the United States, she held influence in boardrooms across the globe. But she never traveled with an entourage or wore her wealth on her sleeve. Power, she had learned, didn't need to be flaunted. She approached the first-class boarding gate calmly, offering her pass to the attendant with a warm smile. The young man scanned it, did a double take at the name, then quickly nodded and said, "Enjoy your flight, Miss Johnson." His tone carried no weight of recognition. He didn't know who she was, only that her ticket cleared. That was exactly how she liked it. Inside the jet bridge, Amara inhaled deeply. There was always something about that moment. Right before stepping onto a plane, the smell of recycled air, the muffled echoes of footsteps, the anticipation of being suspended in the sky. She smiled to herself. Flying had fascinated her since childhood. It wasn't just transportation. It was freedom. When she entered the cabin, the plushness of first class greeted her immediately. Wide leather seats, soft ambient lighting, the faint notes of champagne and citrus-scented disinfectant. A flight attendant gave her a polite nod, though her eyes flickered briefly, betraying surprise. Amara ignored it and walked gracefully down the aisle to seat 2A by the window. She settled in, tucking her satchel neatly under the seat in front of her. From it, she withdrew a hardcover book, the edges worn with use. While most first-class passengers scrolled on their phones or adjusted expensive noise-canceling headphones, Amara preferred the quiet company of a story. She flipped the pages slowly, as though savoring each line. Around her, the cabin began to fill. A middle-aged businessman in a sharp gray suit sat across the aisle, immediately opening his laptop. He cast her a brief glance before returning to his emails. A young couple with designer luggage slid into the row behind, whispering to each other about their honeymoon in Paris. Another man, older, with salt and pepper hair and a gold watch, eyed Amara with faint confusion before looking away. It was subtle, but she noticed. She always noticed. The second glances, the quick assessments, the silent questions that hung in the air whenever she sat in spaces people didn't expect her to occupy. She had felt them in private clubs, at galas, and now, even here, at 30,000 feet's promise. First class, she thought wryly, still carried unspoken boundaries for some. The flight attendant, a slim woman with perfect makeup and a too-bright smile, stopped at Amara's row. "Excuse me, miss," she said softly, bending slightly as if to avoid disturbing others. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Amara looked up from her book. Her voice was calm, steady, almost amused. "Yes, Chue." The attendant hesitated, then held out her hand. "Could I just see your boarding pass again, please?" Without irritation, Amara reached into the seat pocket, where she had already placed her pass. She handed it over smoothly. The attendant scanned it quickly, then froze when the words confirmed her mistake. The ticket was valid. The seat was indeed Amara's. "Oh," the attendant stammered, flustered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. My apologies, Ms. Johnson," Amara finished politely, though her tone carried no sharpness. She wasn't angry. She had seen this scene play out too many times before. The attendant nodded quickly and retreated, though Amara could feel her confusion linger. Around her, the passengers who had overheard shifted in their seats, some pretending not to stare, others whispering softly. Amara returned to her book, pretending not to notice, though a quiet sigh escaped her lips. Respect. It was such a simple thing, yet so often denied until proven otherwise. People rarely questioned the older businessman or the wealthy-looking couple behind her. But for her young black and dressed simply doubt was instinctive. She had been tested this way all her life. In boardrooms, men twice her age assumed she was someone's assistant. In five-star hotels, clerks assumed she couldn't afford the room. Even in spaces she quietly owned, like this airline, she had to prove she belonged. Amara wasn't bitter. She had learned long ago that bitterness was heavy baggage. Instead, she wore patience like armor. Every assumption people made about her became another layer of quiet strength. As she sipped a glass of water offered by another attendant, this one friendlier, she allowed herself a small smile. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them whisper. She had nothing to prove. Outside the windows, the last rays of evening light bathed the tarmac in gold. Luggage carts beeped and workers bustled about, preparing the plane for its journey. Inside, the cabin filled with murmurs and the faint rustle of newspapers. The mood was calm, but beneath it all, a quiet tension stirred the kind that came not from turbulence, but from human judgment. Amara turned another page in her book, her eyes steady, her posture graceful. She was ready for the long flight ahead. What she did not know, what no one knew, was that this journey would not be remembered for its destination, but for the storm about to unfold before the plane ever left the ground. The first-class cabin had a hush about it, the kind of silence reserved for spaces where wealth was assumed and comfort was purchased. The overhead lights glowed in a soft amber, illuminating polished wooden accents and leather seating. To most passengers, this was routine, a business trip, a vacation, a honeymoon. But for Amara Johnson, it was something else entirely. A test she hadn't asked for, but had long learned to expect. She had just tucked her boarding pass back into the seat pocket when she felt its eyes. Not one pair, not two, but several. Quick glances darting toward her, some subtle, some less so. A man across the aisle, silver hair slicked back, adjusted. His Rolex and studied her for longer than politeness allowed. When she met his gaze, he looked away quickly, pretending to search for something in his briefcase. Behind her, a woman's whisper floated through the air, carried by the stillness of the cabin. "Do you think she's—" The sentence trailed off, unfinished but sharp enough to cut. A muffled laugh followed, the kind that wasn't cruel enough to be obvious, yet wasn't kind enough to ignore. Amara lowered her eyes back to her book, pretending to read, though she had yet to finish the same paragraph she'd started 15 minutes earlier. She was used to it, the unease, the doubts, the questions unspoken, but loudly present. Still, it pressed on her shoulders, heavy as the carry-ons in the overhead bins. The flight attendant from earlier reappeared, her steps clipped, her smile strained at the edges. She stopped by Amara's seat once more, crouching slightly so her voice wouldn't carry. "Miss Johnson, is there? Is there anything you need? Before takeoff?" she asked, but the tone wasn't warm, it was cautious, almost probing, as if checking again whether Amara truly belonged there. Amara looked at her with calm, steady eyes. "No, thank you. I'm fine." The attendant hesitated, then gave a nod that was just a little too quick, a little too eager to leave. She disappeared toward the galley, but not before shooting another glance back at Amara, her brow furrowed. Around her, the other passengers were settling in, yet their movements felt louder, sharper, as though her presence had disrupted the unspoken rhythm of first class. The businessman with the laptop kept glancing up from his emails, curiosity flickering across his face each time he looked at her. The honeymoon couple behind whispered in low tones, giggling occasionally, though their laughter didn't quite carry joy, it carried doubt. Amara closed her book softly, sliding a finger between the pages to hold her place. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting out the window where airport lights blinked like distant stars. She breathed slowly, evenly, but inside, her thoughts churned. It was always the same script, different stage. When she walked into rooms where people didn't expect her, the questions followed. Was she lost? Was she in the wrong place? Was she someone's guest, assistant, or charity case? Rarely did anyone assume she was the one signing the checks, the one quietly funding the very systems they moved through. A flight attendant's voice cut through her reflection, addressing a passenger 2 rows ahead. "Would you like champagne or sparkling water before takeoff?" The passenger chose champagne, of course, laughing as though the decision itself was an indulgence. Moments later, another attendant passed Amara's seat, tray in hand. She paused, almost reluctantly. "And for you, miss? Sparkling water?" The way she skipped over champagne was subtle, but not lost on Amara. She tilted her head slightly, offering a polite but pointed smile. "Champagne, please." The attendant blinked, then nodded, flustered. "Of course, champagne, right away." She hurried off, her cheeks tinged with pink. The businessman across the aisle chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if amused by some private joke. Amara heard it, but didn't react. Instead, she folded her hands neatly in her lap, every gesture deliberate, calm. Dignity had always been her armor. Her champagne arrived a minute later, bubbles rising in the glass like golden sparks. She lifted it gently, not to toast, but to remind herself of something important. She was here because she had earned it, because she belonged, whether anyone else believed it or not. Still, the eyes lingered. The unease wasn't hers, it belonged to the cabin, to those who couldn't reconcile her presence with their assumptions. She could feel their thoughts, even without words. She doesn't look like she belongs here. She doesn't act like the others. Who is she? The questions wrapped around her like invisible chains, but Amara refused to carry them. She sipped her champagne slowly, savoring the crisp taste. If they needed to know who she was, time would tell. For now, she was content to let their doubts sit with them, not her. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, deep and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We'll be pushing back shortly. Please settle into your seats and prepare for departure." As his words echoed through the cabin, Amara's gaze drifted once more to the passengers around her. Some leaned back with the satisfaction of wealth well spent, others busied themselves with tablets and phones. Yet even as the captain's announcement ended, the tension in first class didn't dissipate. The uneasy eyes remained, their silent weight pressing in from every direction. Amara exhaled softly, her mind calm despite the undercurrent around her. She had walked into spaces like this before, and she would again. But tonight, as the engines prepared to roar and the cabin braced for takeoff, she sensed something different. Something was coming, something that would not stay confined to uneasy eyes and whispered doubts. For now, though, she sat quietly, hands folded, a woman with secrets the cabin could not yet fathom, and the storm brewing just beyond the horizon had only begun to stir. The low hum of the aircraft deepened as the engines warmed for departure. Passengers shifted in their wide leather seats. Attendants checked overhead bins, and the last few announcements murmured through the cabin speakers. First class, usually a haven of quiet indulgence, was still alive with the silent electricity Amara felt pressing against her from every angle. She could feel the judgment, the whispers, the weight of curiosity she had not invited. And then he arrived, Captain Reynolds. For 30 years, he had been the face of professionalism for the airline, decorated, respected, and trusted by the thousands of passengers he had carried across skies. Tall and broad-shouldered, with thinning blonde hair slicked back beneath his hat, he exuded authority the way some men wore cologne. Strong, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. His uniform was crisp, his tie sharp, and a gleaming set of pilot wings adorned his chest. When he entered the first-class cabin, heads turned automatically. It was tradition, something he enjoyed, to stroll through first class before a long flight. Passengers liked the attention. It reassured them. To them, the captain was not just a pilot, he was a guardian, a steady hand on the controls at 30,000 feet. Reynolds knew this, and he played the role well. He greeted passengers warmly, shook a hand here, nodded politely there. A couple thanked him profusely for the upcoming journey. He smiled, practiced but genuine enough to be convincing. But when his eyes landed on Amara Johnson in seat 2A, something changed. The warmth in his expression cooled, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. His smile faltered, his step slowed. For a brief moment, he simply stared, as though recalculating a puzzle that made no sense. A young black woman, alone, dressed simply, sitting in one of the most coveted seats on the aircraft. To him, it didn't align. It didn't belong. Reynolds leaned slightly toward the nearest flight attendant, his voice low, but not low enough. "Check her seat," he muttered. Amara's ears caught the words clearly. Her hands remained folded, neatly in her lap, her gaze steady, but inside, a quiet sigh uncurled in her chest. She had heard those words before, spoken in different ways, on different stages. Always the same question, just dressed in different clothing. "Do you belong here?" The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. She had already checked Amara's ticket once and been embarrassed by her mistake. But the captain's tone carried authority too heavy to resist. She approached cautiously, forcing a smile. "Miss Johnson," she said softly, "the captain just wants to be sure we've got everything right. May I see your boarding pass one more time?" The businessman across the aisle looked up, eyebrows raised, clearly intrigued. The whispering couple behind Amara leaned forward slightly, their curiosity barely concealed. Phones shifted discreetly in hands, as if a recording might soon become necessary. Amara reached calmly into the seat pocket again, retrieving her pass with deliberate patience. She held it out, her eyes never leaving the captain's. There was no tremor in her hand, no flicker of embarrassment, only quiet, unwavering composure. The attendant checked it, her face coloring with regret. "Yes, seat 2A. That's correct." Reynolds frowned. He stepped closer, towering over Amara, his voice firm, carrying just enough edge to echo through the cabin. "Miss, this section is reserved for first-class passengers. Are you sure you haven't mistaken your ticket? Perhaps you meant to sit in economy." The air in the cabin thinned. Gasps whispered like wind through the rows. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. A businessman across the aisle closed his laptop, leaning back to watch the exchange more openly now. Amara's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not mocking but measured, controlled. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady as still. "Water. Seat 2A. That's mine. I haven't mistaken anything." Her tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was factual, undeniable. Yet it only seemed to irritate the captain further. He gestured toward the boarding pass in her hand, his movements sharp, impatient. "Let me see that." Before Amara could react, he snatched it from her fingers. The paper slipped, fluttered downward, and landed lightly on the carpet. The gesture wasn't violent, but it was dismissive, an assertion of power, the kind of authority Reynolds believed was his to wield without consequence. Gasps rose louder this time. A woman 2 rows back whispered, "Did he just?" A young man discreetly raised his phone, camera already recording. Amara didn't flinch. Slowly, gracefully, she bent, retrieved the pass, and set it back on her lap. Her every motion was deliberate, controlled, as though she were performing a ritual of dignity. When she looked up, her eyes met the captain's again, and for the first time, it was he who shifted uncomfortably. The silence that followed was louder than any words. Passengers glanced between the captain and Amara, tension prickling the air. Some looked appalled, others curious, a few even defensive of the pilot's behavior. But no one could deny the imbalance they had just witnessed. A man of authority, using it like a hammer. A woman holding her ground with nothing but calm. For Amara, it wasn't new. She had endured louder insults, harsher tones, crueler dismissals. But something about this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the cabin full of witnesses. Perhaps it was the sheer arrogance dripping from the captain's voice. Or perhaps it was the irony, the sharp, unspoken irony that she, of all people, had chosen to support this airline in the shadows, had poured her wealth into its future, only to be humiliated in its present. She took a slow sip of her champagne, her hands steady, her face serene. The captain lingered, clearly uncertain how to proceed. His authority had been challenged, not by anger, not by confrontation, but by silence too dignified to touch. The businessman across the aisle broke the tension with a voice firm enough for all to hear. "She's shown you her ticket twice. She belongs here." The words hung in the air, cutting through the quiet like a knife. A few passengers nodded subtly. Others leaned back, watching, waiting. The captain's jaw tightened, his authority slipping further from his grasp. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. The stage had been set, and the next act was inevitable. The air in the first-class cabin had shifted. What moments ago was a hush of wealth and quiet luxury had become a stage, thick with tension and unease. Conversations had died down. Screens were lowered. All eyes, whether directly or from the corners of suspicion, were fixed on the scene unfolding between the captain and the young woman in seat 2A. Captain Reynolds stood tall, his hands planted firmly on his hips, the gleam of his badge catching the cabin lights. He was a man used to control, to obedience, to unchallenged respect. But here, now, he felt something foreign gnawing at him defiance, though Amara Johnson had not raised her voice, had not even shifted in her seat. She was too calm, and that calm unsettled him more than shouting ever could. "Miss," Reynolds said again, louder now, the authoritative bark of a man trying to reassert his dominance. "This section is reserved. You cannot just before." He could finish. Amara lifted her hand slightly, stopping him with nothing more than a gesture. Her expression was serene, her eyes steady, but her voice, when it came, was quiet steel. "I told you," she said evenly. "This is my seat." The clarity of her tone rang through the cabin. Not loud, not angry, but final. The captain's face flushed. His authority was slipping, and the weight of the watching eyes pressed heavily on him. In 30 years, he had been the unquestioned leader in the cabin. To be doubted worse, to be corrected by a passenger he already judged as an outsider, was intolerable. Reynolds reached down suddenly, plucking the boarding pass from Amara's lap with a sharp, dismissive motion. The thin slip of paper tore slightly at the corner as he yanked it up, holding it high as though it were evidence of some crime. The violence of the gesture was small, yet it carried a brutality that shocked the onlookers. Gasps rippled through the rows. The honeymooning woman behind Amara pressed a hand to her mouth. The silver-haired man with the Rolex muttered, "Good Lord," while the businessman across the aisle leaned forward, disbelief etched across his face. Somewhere down the row, the soft click of a phone camera activating was followed by the discreet angling of a lens. Reynolds waved the ticket at the nearest attendant, his voice booming now. "Verify this again." Immediately, the attendant, pale and trembling, took the ticket as if it were hot coal. Her eyes darted to Amara, then back to the captain. She nodded quickly and retreated, her heels clicking briskly on the aisle floor. Amara did not move. She simply folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture dignified, her expression calm. She could feel every pair of eyes in the cabin on her. Some sympathetic, some curious, some she knew agreeing with the captain's unspoken assumptions. But she gave none of them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her silence was louder than shouting. Reynolds, perhaps sensing it, leaned down closer, his voice dropping just enough to be menacing. "If you think you can sit here and play games with me, you're mistaken." Amara turned her head slowly to face him fully. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, the captain faltered. Hers were not the eyes of someone playing games. They were the eyes of someone who had seen this confrontation before, lived it, endured it, and refused to bow. She spoke so quietly that only those nearest could hear. Respect should not be a game. The words landed like a blow. Passengers who caught them stiffened in their seats. The businessman across the aisle whispered under his breath, "She's right." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the engines outside, roaring faintly as they prepared for departure, seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. The flight attendant returned, holding the boarding pass as though it carried judgment. Her face was tight, her voice careful. "Captain, her seat is correct. She belongs here." Reynolds froze. The confirmation, spoken aloud for the whole cabin to hear, stripped him of the last thread of his authority in the exchange. Passengers murmured, some with relief, others with disapproval, directed squarely at him. Still, his pride would not let go. He straightened, tugging at his uniform. "Very well," he said stiffly, voice strained, "but I'll have this noted." The businessman across the aisle could no longer contain himself. He closed his laptop with a snap and spoke loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Noted? The only thing that should be noted is your behavior." She showed her ticket. "Twice. You humiliated her. Twice. And for what? Because she didn't fit your picture of a first-class passenger?" The words cut through the air like lightning. Murmurs erupted around the cabin, passengers emboldened by the confrontation. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered to one another, the discontent growing like a tide. Amara remained silent, letting the moment expand. She could have spoken, could have condemned him, but she knew silence sometimes carried more weight than words. Her calm, her refusal to break, only magnified the captain's aggression. Reynolds, red-faced, tried to muster dignity, but the murmurs and the eyes and the phones recording every second pinned him in place. For the first time in his career, he was not the unquestioned figure of authority in the cabin. He was the spectacle, the aggressor, a man out of step with the moment. Amara picked up her glass of champagne and raised it slowly, deliberately, as if to toast not to him, not to anyone, but to herself, to her patience, to her right to sit exactly where she was. She sipped, unbothered, unbroken. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. And in that stillness, passengers understood the clash in first class was not about a seat. It was about dignity, about who was seen, who was doubted, and who was forced to prove their place in spaces that should have welcomed them without question. And though the storm was far from over, Amara had already won the first battle, not with rage, not with wealth, but with unshakable grace. For a long moment, the cabin was locked in silence. The hum of the engines throbbed faintly beneath the still air, but inside first class, not a soul moved. It was as though every passenger understood that something irreversible had just happened. A line had been crossed. Captain Reynolds still loomed in the aisle, his face flushed, his jaw tight. Amara Johnson sat calmly in seat 2A, her champagne glass poised lightly in her hand, her gaze leveled and serene. Between them lay the thin boarding pass, its edges still bent from his earlier outburst. It was not just paper anymore. It was evidence. The silence cracked when the businessman across the aisle, the one with the sharp gray suit and laptop, spoke. Again, his voice was louder this time, intentionally carrying through the cabin. "She belongs here," he said firmly, looking directly at the captain. "And you owe her an apology." A ripple of murmurs swept through the rows. Heads turned. Shoulders shifted. The tension that had hovered like static began to move, spreading through the crowd. The young woman seated behind Amara leaned forward, her eyes flashing indignation. "I saw what happened." She showed her ticket. "You hid it right out of her hand." Her husband nodded beside her, his arm protectively draped around her shoulders. "That's not how you treat people," he added, his voice low but strong. Another voice joined in, older and measured. The silver-haired man with the Rolex cleared his throat. "Captain, with all due respect, you're embarrassing yourself. And this airline." His words carried the calm authority of a man used to being listened to, and they landed heavily. Phones were out now. Small glowing rectangles tilted discreetly, but unmistakably recording every moment. The captain could see it, the silent judgment of the lenses, capturing his every word, every gesture, broadcasting them beyond the cabin. "Sir," a passenger 2 rows back, said loudly enough to cut through the growing murmur, "you need to let this go. She's right." "You're wrong." The murmurs swelled into something heavier. What had begun as quiet whispers of curiosity was now a tide of disapproval, building against him. He had stepped into a fight he could not win, and worse, he had chosen the wrong opponent. Amara sat perfectly still, her silence speaking volumes. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She let the passengers do it for her. Every voice that rose in her defense was another crack in the captain's armor. Reynolds stiffened, trying to salvage authority. "I was only ensuring protocol," he barked, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. "I have a responsibility to maintain order in this cabin." "Order?" The businessman scoffed. "Order isn't humiliating a woman in front of the entire plane. Order isn't dismissing her when she's done nothing wrong." His voice sharpened. "Order is respect." The word landed like a gavel, and the murmurs grew louder. Passengers nodded, some muttering agreement, others holding their cameras higher now, less discreet. The young woman behind Amara leaned further into the aisle. "You can't just treat people like they don't belong. That's not order, that's arrogance." Her words struck, and several passengers murmured agreement. Someone clapped softly sarcastic. Applause that cut deeper than words. The captain's cheeks burned crimson. His mouth opened, but no defense came. He looked at Amara again, hoping she would break, would lash out, would give him the confrontation he thought he needed to win. But she only met his gaze with a calm so unshakable it felt like a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness. Back at him, another passenger, a middle-aged woman in a navy dress, raised her voice from 3 rows back. "I'm recording this, and I'm sending it straight to the airline." Phones rose higher now. No one was hiding it anymore. Every angle, every word was being captured. The captain's authority, once absolute, was unraveling in front of him. He looked around, and where once he would have found respect, even deference, he saw only judgment. Passengers shaking their heads, eyes filled with disapproval. Mouths whispering words he didn't want to hear. Disgrace, unacceptable, shame. The murmurs swelled until they became something louder, voices layering on top of one another, forming a chorus of dissent. It wasn't just 1 or 2 anymore. The cabin had turned against him, and still Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own testimony, her dignity its own defense. In refusing to argue, she had allowed the truth to speak for itself. The more the passengers rallied to her, the more powerless the captain became. At last, the businessman across the aisle leaned forward again, his voice cold, deliberate. "Captain, you can either walk away now, or you can watch your career end on YouTube tonight. Your choice." The words struck like thunder. The cabin fell into silence once more, waiting, watching. Reynolds swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He straightened his jacket, tugged at his tie, but his movements were stiff, robotic. He glanced once more at Amara, who sat poised, unbroken, sipping her champagne with unhurried grace. He turned sharply and strode toward the galley without another word. The cabin exhaled collectively, the pressure lifting slightly, though the tension lingered. Passengers turned to Amara now, some offering small smiles, others nodding in quiet solidarity. The businessman gave her a respectful nod, as though acknowledging a victory that had been hers all along. Amara inclined her head slightly, a silent thank you, though her lips never parted. She didn't need to say anything. Her dignity had spoken for her. For the first time since she boarded, she allowed herself a slow, measured breath. The clash was not over. She knew the storm had only just begun. But in that moment, she had something more powerful than silence or wealth. She had witnesses, and their voices had joined hers, turning the tide in her favor. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet after Captain Reynolds stormed off toward the galley, his shoes striking the aisle floor with the stiffness of a man fighting ghosts. Passengers whispered to each other, glancing at Amara, who sat serene in her seat. The champagne glass in her hand caught the light, the bubbles rising like tiny embers. She looked every bit the part of a queen who had chosen silence over spectacle. But silence never lasted long in a cabin filled with restless curiosity. The businessman across the aisle leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but keeping it audible for those nearby. "Forgive me," he said carefully, "but I have the sense you're not just another passenger." His words carried both caution and intrigue, as if he were piecing together a puzzle he couldn't yet see clearly. Amara's gaze flickered to him, then away again, as though deciding whether to answer. For the briefest moment, her lips curved into a smile, subtle, enigmatic, enough to suggest more than it revealed. She didn't reply, not yet. The young woman seated behind her couldn't contain herself. "Honestly, the way you handled him. Like you've done this before. Who even stays that calm when the captain of a plane tries to humiliate them?" Her husband added, "Yeah, and the way you didn't flinch. That was something else." Amara gave a soft laugh, warm, but edged with something heavier. "Let's just say," she murmured, "I've had practice." Before more questions could circle, the head flight attendant approached cautiously, her posture stiff with nerves. In her hand was a tablet, the kind used for crew manifests and seat assignments. She stopped beside Amara's seat, glanced at the businessman, then at the curious faces nearby. "Miss Johnson?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Yes," Amara replied, calm as ever. The attendant swallowed, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the tablet around for the young woman to see. On the glowing screen was a passenger profile name, ticket, frequent flyer status. And just beneath the lines of text, in bold, corporate lettering, Executive Stakeholder Clearance Priority Access. Gasps rustled through the rows. The businessman blinked. Executive stakeholder? His voice rose in disbelief. "Wait, are you saying? She owns part of this airline?" The attendant's silence was answer enough. She shifted uncomfortably, then lowered her voice. "Miss Johnson is one of our private investors. A majority backer." The word spread like wildfire. Heads turned, jaws dropped. Even the passengers in the farthest rows of first class craned their necks to see, their whispers swelling into a wave of astonishment. Phones that had been recording stayed trained on Amara, now with renewed intensity. Amara set her glass down gently, folding her hands in her lap. Her voice was measured, low, but every syllable carried weight. "I prefer to travel quietly, without attention. But sometimes, attention finds me anyway." The young woman behind her gaped. "You mean, you own this? Like this airline?" Amara tilted her head thoughtfully. "Ownership is complicated. But yes, this airline exists in part because of my investment." She looked toward the galley where Reynolds had vanished. "And because of my trust." The businessman exhaled, sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. Unbelievable. The captain picked the worst possible fight he could have imagined. The murmurs grew louder now, passengers buzzing like bees in a hive. A woman further back muttered, "This is going to go viral in seconds." Another added, "That man's career is finished." The weight of the revelation shifted the air itself. Amara was no longer simply a wronged passenger. She was the wronged power, a hidden force who had chosen humility until provocation forced her hand. The irony was sharp enough to sting. The captain had questioned her right to be in first class, when in truth, she could have bought the entire plane a dozen times over. At that exact moment, Captain Reynolds re-emerged from the galley, his stride slower now, his bravado cracked but not yet broken. He hadn't heard the revelation, not yet. He returned to the aisle as though ready to reassert control, but the cabin's eyes met him differently this time, judgment sharper, anger clearer. He stopped short when he noticed the hush that fell upon his return. Passengers leaned back, arms folded, eyes narrowed, phones tilted deliberately toward him. Something had shifted, and even in his stubbornness, he felt it. "What?" he demanded, his voice brittle. "What's everyone staring at?" The head attendant, her courage bolstered by the truth she now held, stepped forward. She extended the tablet toward him, her voice steady. "Captain, you need to see this." Reynolds took the device, frowning. His eyes scanned the screen. Once, then twice, then again, as though the words themselves refused to compute. His lips moved soundlessly as he read the bold line, "Executive Stakeholder, Clearance Priority Access." His face drained of color. A silence fell, thick and suffocating. Passengers watched, waiting for his reaction. For the first time in his long career, Captain Reynolds looked like a man who had lost the ground beneath his feet. Amara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply met his eyes with quiet strength, then spoke in the same calm tone she had carried all along. "You doubted my right to sit here," she said. "But this seat, this cabin, this airline exists because people like me believed in it, and people like me don't forget disrespect so easily." The words weren't loud, but they thundered in every corner of the cabin. Gasps echoed. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "He's finished." Reynolds's mouth opened, but no words came. He tried again, stammering. I didn't know. Exactly, Amara interrupted gently, her eyes never leaving his. You didn't know. And you didn't care to. That's the problem. Her words cut sharper than any raised voice could. Passengers nodded in agreement, some clapping softly, their applause spreading until it became a ripple of approval. The businessman across the aisle joined in, his eyes fixed on the captain. "Bravo," he said. "Well said." The captain's authority was gone, shredded by truth and humiliation. He stood frozen, caught between apology and collapse, his career teetering on the edge of ruin. And in seat 2A, Amara Johnson sat unbothered, her power finally visible, her dignity untouchable. The revelation had come, and it had turned the entire cabin into witnesses of justice. The storm was not over, but the tide had turned. The engines roared softly as the plane leveled into its cruising altitude, but inside the cabin, the true turbulence was human. The revelation of Amara Johnson's identity had detonated like a quiet bomb, leaving shockwaves that rippled through every seat. The captain's face remained pale as he clutched the tablet, the truth branding itself into his skin like fire. He stood in the aisle, suddenly stripped of the authority he had carried with arrogance only minutes before. The man who once represented command now looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. Passengers watched him with a mixture of disgust, fascination, and barely concealed anger. Every whisper carried a verdict. He hit her boarding pass, and she owns the airline? Unbelievable. He's done for. Phones recorded every angle. Some passengers had already uploaded snippets to social media, their thumbs moving feverishly as captions sprouted like weeds. Pilot humiliates black woman in first class. Turns out she's the billionaire who bankrolls the airline. A storm was already brewing online, even as the plane sliced through clouds. Reynolds finally handed the tablet back to the flight attendant, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon what was left of his authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice straining, This is a misunderstanding. A simple misunderstanding?" The businessman across the aisle cut in sharply, his voice booming like a gavel. "You struck her ticket from her hand in front of witnesses. That's not a misunderstanding. That's disrespect." The words landed heavy. Passengers nodded, some muttering in agreement. The young woman behind Amara leaned forward again, fire in her eyes. "Don't downplay what you did. We all saw it. You tried to humiliate her." Reynolds faltered, his throat dry. He opened his mouth again, but another passenger, the older man with a Rolex, raised a hand. "Captain, I've flown hundreds of times. I've seen good captains lead with dignity. But what I saw from you? That wasn't dignity. That was prejudice. Plain and simple." The cabin erupted into murmurs, again some sharp, some approving. Each voice seemed to chip away at what little power Reynolds still clung to. Amara, through it all, remained composed. She had not once raised her voice, not once lashed out. Instead, she sat with a calmness that only deepened her aura. She was no longer just a passenger, nor just an investor. She was the storm's eye still. Steady, untouchable. The head attendant stepped forward again, her own confidence rising now that she knew the truth. She turned to the captain, her voice firm. "With respect, sir, you've compromised the professionalism of this flight. I'll be reporting this." Gasps fluttered through the cabin. For a flight attendant to openly challenge a captain mid-flight was almost unheard of. But in this moment, the power dynamic had shifted so completely that her words carried more weight than his uniform. Reynolds stiffened. "You'll do no such." "Actually, she will." It was Amara's voice at last, clear and resonant, cutting through the air like a bell. Every passenger fell silent, hanging on her words. Amara turned her gaze to the captain. Her eyes were steady, calm, but there was steel in her tone. Accountability is not optional. You disrespected me in front of this cabin, and by extension, you disrespected this airline. An airline I have supported with millions of dollars, and more importantly, with trust. Reynolds flinched as though struck. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Amara continued, her voice calm but commanding. You see a passenger. I see people who choose to place their safety, comfort, and dignity in the hands of this company. Every day. When you insult me, you insult every one of them. That is not leadership. That is failure. Applause broke out, first soft, then swelling until the entire cabin echoed with it. Even in economy, passengers craned their necks, clapping along as the news trickled back row by row. Reynolds' lips pressed into a thin line. He turned stiffly, retreating toward the cockpit with heavy steps. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, shutting him off from the very people he had once ruled over with unquestioned command. The businessman leaned across the aisle, his voice lowered now, meant for Amara. That was remarkable. You didn't just win the moment. You owned it. Amara allowed herself the faintest smile. Sometimes silence teaches louder than shouting ever could. The young woman behind her spoke again, her tone filled with awe. I'll never forget this flight. Ever. The way you handled him. You made us all feel stronger. The cabin felt different now, lighter, but also charged with something electric. People exchanged smiles, nods, glances of shared victory. The unity forged in the confrontation was palpable, a reminder of what it meant to stand together against injustice. Meanwhile, the attendants whispered among themselves in the galley, their eyes flicking toward the cockpit door. Though no one said it outright, the implication was clear. This flight would end with more than just a landing. Reports would be filed, calls made, careers ended. Amara leaned back in her seat, finally allowing her breath to ease. The storm was not finished. She knew the aftermath on the ground would be even bigger than what had happened here, at 30,000 feet. But for now, she had something precious. Silence. Not the silence of oppression or dismissal, but the silence of victory. As she gazed out the window, the clouds stretched like endless fields below, the horizon painted in orange and gold. For the first time since boarding, Amara allowed herself a small, private smile. The captain had tried to strip her dignity away. Instead, he had handed her a stage. And the world witnesses in this cabin and countless more online was already listening. The fallout had begun. The rest of the flight passed under a cloud of uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional whispers of passengers sharing theories about what would happen when the wheels touched the ground. Flight attendants moved with unusual gravity, there. Service polite but subdued. Even champagne glasses seemed to clink softer, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Amara sat still in seat 2A, gazing out at the endless horizon. The glow of sunset washed her face in gold, painting her not as a victim, but as something greater, a quiet force the world had underestimated, now revealed. She felt the weight of eyes on her, some still in awe, others buzzing with unspoken gratitude. Behind her, the young woman whispered to her husband, "It's history, isn't it? We're watching something we'll tell people about for years." He nodded. She didn't just put him in his place. She showed us what real power looks like. In the cockpit, Reynolds sat stiff, his hands resting uselessly on the controls. Though the autopilot guided the plane, his mind reeled. Images replayed like punishments, the ticket in his hand, the shocked gasps, the bold words of the woman he had belittled, an investor, a backer, a billionaire. The humiliation gnawed at him, not just because of the exposure, but because deep Down, he knew the truth. He had judged before he had cared to see. As the city lights flickered into view below, the cabin's tension shifted from mid-air to anticipation of what awaited on the ground. The announcement crackled through the speaker. Reynolds' voice strained but formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." His tone carried none of the confidence that usually marked a captain's authority. Instead, it was flat, heavy, a man speaking from the ruins of his pride. The plane descended smoothly, wheels kissing the runway with a soft thud. Applause broke out not for him, but for the relief of landing, for the release of pressure that had hung in the cabin like a storm cloud. As the plane slowed on the tarmac, Amara remained still, her calm presence unbroken. But outside, unseen. By most, the fallout had already gathered. Airport staff stood waiting at the gate, security officers lingering nearby. And at the front of the line of uniforms, a sharply dressed airline executive held a tablet in one hand, his expression taut. When the doors opened and the jet bridge attached, passengers rose, eager to disembark, but no one missed the sight of executives boarding first, their eyes scanning until they found Amara. The businessman across the aisle leaned closer. "There. Here for you." Amara only smiled faintly. "No, they're here because of him." Her words proved true. The airline executive stepped forward quickly, bypassing passengers and attendants alike. He stopped at Amara's seat, bowing his head. Respectfully, "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice crisp, "we owe you both an apology and an explanation. On behalf of the company, please allow us to escort you privately." Before Amara could reply, the cockpit door opened, and Reynolds stepped out, his shoulders squared in a fragile attempt to salvage dignity. But the executive's eyes hardened. "Captain Reynolds," he said sharply, "step aside. You'll be speaking to HR and compliance immediately." A murmur spread across the cabin. Consequences had come quickly. Passengers pulled out their phones again, recording the moment. The captain, once untouchable, stood frozen, jaw clenched. His career, built over decades, was crumbling in real time under the watch of strangers with cameras. Reynolds tried to protest. "This is absurd. I made a mistake, yes, but a mistake?" The executive cut him off, voice like steel. "You disrespected a passenger in front of dozens of witnesses. Not just any passenger, the investor, whose funding helped keep this airline alive during the pandemic. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The words landed like a verdict. Gasps filled the air again. Reynolds' face crumpled, shame coloring his features. Meanwhile, Amara rose slowly, her posture graceful and unhurried. She gathered her bag, her movements calm, almost regal. As she stepped into the aisle, passengers leaned away slightly, not in rejection, but in reverence, as though giving space to someone who had transcended the ordinary. The businessman clapped first, standing to honor her. "Miss Johnson," he said loudly, "thank you for showing us what real dignity looks like." Applause followed, spreading from first class into the rows behind, echoing through the cabin until it became a chorus. Strangers smiled at her, nodded with respect, some even murmuring thank you. Amara didn't bask in it. She only inclined her head, acknowledging them with grace, before walking down the aisle toward the waiting executives. Each step was slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of the story that had unfolded above the clouds. As she exited the plane, cameras flashed. Journalists had already caught wind of the incident, alerted by the wildfire spread of videos uploaded mid-flight. Headlines were forming in real time. Captain confronts black woman in first class. She's the billionaire behind the airline. Power, prejudice, and poise at 30,000 feet. Amara Johnson, the silent force who brought a pilot to his knees. In the private lounge, executives scrambled to apologize, offering reassurances, policies, and promises of reform. But Amara listened in silence, her eyes scanning their faces. She didn't want rehearsed apologies, she wanted change. Finally, she spoke. This wasn't just about me. This was about how easily dignity can be stripped when judgment comes. Before respect, you can't fix that with policy alone. You fix it with culture, with accountability. And culture starts at the top. Her words hung in the air, undeniable. The executives nodded quickly, their pens scratching notes, their faces pale with urgency. They knew this wasn't a story that could be buried. It was already global. But more than that, it was personal. When she finally left the airport through a private exit, the night air was cool against her skin. She paused, inhaling deeply. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her bag calls, messages, requests for interviews. But she ignored them for now. For the first time all day, Amara allowed herself to breathe freely. Not because she had proven her wealth or power, but because she had shown once again that silence and strength were weapons sharper than arrogance could ever withstand. Back in the terminal, Reynolds sat in a small office, stripped of his stripes, waiting for an investigation that would almost certainly end his career. And across the world, people scrolled their phones, sharing the story of the billionaire in first class who taught a captain and everyone watching what true leadership looked like. Amara's name would soon be everywhere. But for her, the true victory was simpler. She had reminded the world that dignity does not ask for permission, and that respect, when withheld, has consequences no uniform or title can shield against. And with that, she stepped into the waiting car outside the airport, the night swallowing her like a secret once again. The legacy of that flight would live on, told in headlines, whispered in boardrooms, and remembered by every passenger who had watched the balance of power shift at 30,000 feet. It wasn't just a landing. It was a reckoning.